The tale of Gandon and Ilmur is a tragic story that many adventurers have shared around the campfire, still centuries after the events transpired in Elmur. It all started when the king of Eon got attacked by goblins on the open road when he traveled to visit an old childhood friend. He would have met his end that day if it hadn't been for a brave brotherhood nearby that was known as the Men of the Phoenix. The brotherhood came to the king's aid, but the captain of that brotherhood lost his life while protecting the king. After the captain's death, the king was informed by the remaining survivors that the captain had a son named Gandon. The king felt guilty and promised to raise the boy in the capital. Gandon wasn't of royal blood, but he got on really well with the king's second oldest son, Ilmur. They spent their days playing with wooden swords on the nearby hill that had a good view of the capital. They had different strengths and weaknesses, and Gandon could never defeat Ilmur in duel, and eventually he gave up the sword for many years. It was plain visible that Gandon's parents couldn't have been from the north, but they saw each other as brothers nevertheless. But Gandon hated being called a bastard, and hated the fact that he wasn't a real prince, and as he got older he felt it unfair that those he saw beneath him should rule over him, just for being born in the right family. He didn't know what to do with the two boys at first, but when them both expressed an interest in learning magic, found the king a teacher that both could cast fire and ice, which had been unheard of. They both became students of the new master called Ivan. When it came to magic, it was Gandon that was the prodigy, always being book smart compared to Ilmur. From that day on, they spent a lot of time in the sorcerer's garden, tending to the berries that granted sorcerers their powers, because in the beginning of mankind, the natural magic had been stripped away from them. Together they would have been the perfect king, with Gandon's intelligence and with Ilmur's charisma and kindness, but alas they weren't one but two. Over the years, Ilmur being an extrovert became popular with the ladies at court, while Gandon stood by the sidelines. Still everything was alright between them, but the cracks in their friendship would start when Gandon and Ilmur fell in love with the same woman, in the beginning of their adulthood. Alexandra was the daughter of the old king's friend that they had traveled to meet just right after Gandon had been born. The king and his friend wanted to do a marriage alliance with each other, and therefore took Alexandra to the court. Alexandra shared Gandon's love for learning, and they studied together and became friends. Gandon tried to make a move on her, but Alexandra couldn't deal with his unchecked emotions and fragile ego and spurned him. Alexandra's thoughts returned back to the kingdom and her father's wishes, and decided to refocus her energy on Ilmur instead. Gandon tried to write her a letter apologizing and explaining the situation, but she burned it instead, being afraid that something in his letter could make her change her mind, since the letters and books were his battlefield. Gandon could eventually see that Ilmur and Alexandra would marry soon enough, and never revealed to Ilmur that he loved her as well. The king had always known that Gandon would be useful if placed at the right position, and when talks of rebellion were brewing in the eastern part of the kingdom, Gandon was sent there to solve the crisis. Alexandra begged the king to send Ilmur as well, explained that they were strongest together, and the king agreed. During the time in the eastern province, Gandon got a taste for power and how it would feel to rule over others, and he felt that he liked it. Meanwhile had Ilmur impressed the dwarves, and one of the dwarves taught him dwarven smithing, and he made Ilmur's promise to never reveal his smithing to another human. When the crisis seemed averted, the two men returned back to the capital, both feeling sure that in due time Gandon would rule permanently in the eastern province and speak with the king's voice. It gnawed in Ilmur that things would never go back to how things were as they were before. Gandon, however, still feeling in pain over seeing Ilmur in Alexandra's arms, couldn't wait to go. Gandon and Ilmur didn't get to rest when they came to the capital. A mysterious man in a black cloak had threatened the king in a letter, so they did their best to protect him, but it had all been a ruse to kill the crown prince instead. Gandon and Ilmur pursued the man. He in the black cloak sent a projectile of dark magic at Ilmur. Gandon jumped in the way to save him. The man in the black cloak fled from their fight, for Ilmur had become enraged. After the fight, Ilmur checked upon Gandon, and he was still breathing, but he wouldn't wake up. Worried, Ilmur had Gandon taken back to the masters who could reassess the situation. The master could feel the dark magic radiating from Gandon, but he had no idea how to solve the illness. He lay day after day in his room while Ilmur was reading books about dark magic, trying to do anything to save his friend. He eventually got the idea that if he got out in the kingdom, that a big reward in gold would be given to the person who could cure Gandon. They would come from all corners of the world to the capital. The wedding couldn't wait any longer, feeling both pressured from the king and Alexandra's father, and was forced to marry without Gandon and his best man. A few days after the wedding, a man came to court that called himself Cecil, with a cloak split in middle, color black and white. Ilmur had never seen such cloak before and believed that the man had come from the far east. Cecil said that he could cure Gandon, saying that the problem was that they needed to balance out the dark energy in him before he could wake up. Furthermore, they needed to create a magical artifact for it to work, and normal smithing from the humans wouldn't suffice. Only the smithing knowledge from the dwarves would do. This troubled Ilmur, since he remembered his promise to the dwarf he had made when he had spent his time in the eastern part of the kingdom. But he was willing to do anything to save his best friend, and reluctantly agreed to share his knowledge with Cecil. They started work on a project together, but when they were almost done a few weeks later, it was revealed that they needed a dragon's soul for it to work. There were not many dragons left in Elnur, but Cecil knew where they could find one. Ilmur, who had started practicing with ice magic again when he started to study dark magic, felt that he could take on the dragon. They had a fierce battle, but Ilmur, that could protect himself against the fire with its ice magic, eventually won, and the dragon's soul was placed in the silver ring that Ilmur had forged with his knowledge. Ilmur placed the ring on Gandon's finger. First nothing happened, but Gandon woke up the next day. Gandon didn't feel good and his emotions got amplified by the ring. The dragon's soul still be alive in the ring taunted him. Gandon, feeling unappreciated for all he had done for the king and the royal family, slowly started to resent the king. In his mind he saw visions from the dragon where the royal family mocked him, and he started to avoid Ilmur as much as possible. The king wanted to reward both for their service and had 2 blades forged from dwarven steel made for each one of them. Blades of this quality were so rare that it was said that they had never met each other in battle. The king granted Gandon's wish of going back to the eastern part as steward, and Gandon started to plot his revenge. He didn't want Ilmur to suspect anything and feign kindness until it was time to leave. And being back in the eastern part fueled the fire rebellion once again. Gandon slowly started to send less back of the taxes to the capital until one day he stopped completely. Ilmur's youngest brother Tal, who was good with numbers, tried to warn him, but Ilmur wasn't willing to listen, still seeing Gandon as his brother and best friend. While all the plans were in motion, Gandon was also busy studying dark magic, and he took up the sword once again. Gandon, being aided by the dragon through the ring, learned the blade remarkably quickly and felt sure that he could kill Ilmur in a fight if it would come to that. Gandon, not willing to be dependent of the wizards from the capital, started his own order, called Magicians of the Fate, but he had only the time to recruit a few members before the war started. Gandon, that had now studied dark magic and the ring for months, learned to produce transparent wings from his back and flew to the dwarven stronghold to convince the dwarves to join him in his war. Gandon showed the dwarves the silver ring on his hand, and thus it was revealed that the crown prince had broken his promise, and therefore the dwarves promised Ilmur to aid him in his war. The man in the black cloak came to meet Gandon. It was revealed that this was the man called Cecil that had helped Ilmur create the dragon ring. He also wanted the royal family destroyed and promised with his help he could get the goblins to attack Ilmur's army through tunnels when the two hosts would meet each other. Then flew to the magical garden under the disguise of night and torched the berry gardens with his magic, so he would have to fight less mages during the civil war. There the sorcerer's garden got burned down that they had spent so many years tending with care. He saw light from the throne room. The king often went there when he had trouble sleeping. He decided to confront his adoptive father once and for all. Gandon had always wanted to know where he came from and who his parents were, but the king had always avoided the topic. Gandon was right. Since the death of his son, the king had slept even worse than usual. Gandon came in with his blade in hand, but there was no one to aid the king, since Gandon had killed the guards outside. The king refused to give Gandon the answer he sought, but with the help of the dragon ring he could recreate the event from the king's heart. When the vision started, the king begged Gandon to end it, but Gandon wouldn't listen, wanting more than ever to discover the truth. And there he saw during the goblin raid how his father offered his life to save the king, echoing the deed when Gandon had protected Ilmur. When the vision ended, the little love for the royal family that had been still in his heart had ended. Determined now more than ever to destroy the royal family and to end the rule and impose a new ruling system. In his rage he killed the king with his blades before leaving the capital. Ilmur didn't want to believe at first that Gandon had killed the king, but his younger brother Talon wanted to hear none of it. He pointed out that Gandon had stopped sending the taxes without an explanation, and that the guard had spotted someone that had looked a lot like Gandon when he had fled the castle with his wings. Eventually Ilmur had to accept that the Gandon from his childhood no longer existed, and there were now an open civil war with the part that Gandon had been sent to govern. Before the war started, when everything was in order, Gandon killed the man in the black cloak, fearing the man's might, believing he would become a dangerous adversary after the war with the capital. Gandon's plan had succeeded, because with the burning of the garden, the capital could no longer send as many sorcerers as they would have liked, but they still had a larger army. It proved to be a fierce battle. Gandon eventually got the upper lead with his superior tactics. Ilmur's side got attacked by dwarves and even goblins that the man called Cecil had orchestrated. Ilmur figured that he no longer could win the war on the open battlefield. The Moon Mountains were nearby, and he figured that Gandon was lingering there, overseeing the battle. They had visited the abandoned dwarven colony with his master when they were children, and they had always promised that they would come back to that place one day. It was there Gandon and Ilmur met for the last time. Ilmur was enraged while Gandon stood there in cold mockery, proclaiming that the royal family owed Gandon and his father a debt that only could be paid in gold and steel. He proclaimed that his dream couldn't come to fruition before Ilmur was dead. Ilmur, with tears in his eyes, roared and attacked Gandon. It was a battle fought with magic and steel, and now these rare dwarven blades that share kinship finally met upon the battlefield. They both surprised one another, because they both had improved in the area that the other was good at. Ilmur, who had practiced magic again in order to fight the dragon, had improved his ice magic a lot since they had fought the man in the black cloak. Same could be said about Gandon, that had improved his swordsmanship with the help of the dragon's guidance. Ilmur produced ice spears and ice shields to combat Gandon's fire magic, but Gandon also swung dark magic at his former friend. For a duel the battle was long, and it was for the most part uncertain who would come out victorious. Eventually Ilmur got a fatal blow with his sword, and Gandon laid almost still on the ground. Now he looked like the monster that Ilmur had felt that Gandon had become, because one of Gandon's eyes had turned into the shape of a dragon. Before dying, Gandon revealed that Gandon was in love with Alexandra too, and that the kingdom would go up in flames if Ilmur steered it, and that he was too trusting and easily manipulated before he died. Ilmur buried Gandon's corpse, so no one would desecrate the body, telling not a single soul where it laid. He also took Gandon's swords and the ring before he left. He had hoped that with the commander dead that he could still win the war, but that was not so, and therefore the eastern part got their independence after all. Ilmur, who had long been in self-doubt if he would be a good king, decided to never mantle the crown when his insecurities was echoed by Gandon, and the crown passed to Ilmur's younger brother Taln instead. Ilmur, who hadn't liked to read most of his life, had started to appreciate it while he studied the books about dark magic earlier. He started to read in earnest now, and had become a pacifist, never using his sword ever again, scarred by the battle with his best friend. Granted money for a university where they could study the Red Moon. Later a group of dragon hunters had heard of Ilmur's deed, offered him to join them in their quest, but Ilmur refused them. Ilmur and Alexander had a long life together and had many strong sons and daughters that carried over their family line. Even though Gandon hadn't been able to defeat Ilmur in a duel, he had still managed a small part of the kingdom to be free from the royal family's grasp. The dwarves had for a long time used democracy to elect their leaders, but this was the first country by men who did so. He had also managed to change Ilmur in those parts that Gandon had criticized him most of, to become more learned and less naive. Ilmur wrote it all down in his memoirs in his old age, and even though the story has changed over the centuries, the key elements have always been the same. The story has touched many heartstrings, and the story is still popular in the 4th age by the rich and the poor.